Joining us now for World Brief and the review of some of the headlines of today's newspapers from around the world is Adefemi Akinsanya, joining us live from New York City. Good morning, Adefemi.
Good morning, Dr. Rubin. Good morning, Ayo, and good morning, Rufai. Hope you're all doing well. It's always wonderful to start my mornings with you.
Morning.
Thank you, Adefemi.
Well, let me tell you what is happening. Thank you, my friends. Let me tell you what is happening here at the United Nations. Now, if you were expecting a memorable address at the United Nations General Assembly, then US President Donald Trump did not disappoint. He made headlines almost immediately during his remarks and immediately after his remarks at the General Assembly. His words were fiery. He talked about globalization, protectionism, climate change, and migration. And let us not forget that he had some very harsh words for the United Nations itself as an organization. So for a wrap of his comments, let's take a look at what we've put together. President Donald Trump's day at the United Nations got off to a rocky start. First, a glitchy escalator. Then, a tricky teleprompter. He did joke about it, but then his words became far more serious. His first target was the UN itself.
What is the purpose of the United Nations? The UN has such tremendous potential. I've always said it. It has such tremendous potential, but it's not even coming close to living up to that potential. It's empty words, and empty words don't solve war.
Going on to brag about ending 7 wars in 7 months, contrasting his efforts with what he described as UN in action.
About your immigration disaster and the fake energy catastrophe before it's too late.
Arguably, his harshest words were on migration.
You want to be politically correct, and you're destroying your heritage. They must take control strongly and immediately of the unmitigated immigration disaster. It's time to end the failed experiment of open borders. You have to end it now. See, I can tell you. I'm really good at this stuff. Your countries are going to hell.
Well, that was Donald Trump's eventful day here at the United Nations, full of sharp critiques, bold comments, and some humor. Adefemi Akinsanya, Arise News, United Nations headquarters here in New York. This is the thing, in a rare and softer portion of his comments, he did actually make some light comments too. Firstly, he reached out, figuratively of course, at the podium towards Brazilian President Lula da Silva. He said that the pair had embraced just as Lula was leaving, he was entering. And he said that when they saw each other, it was a very, very quick moment where they were able to embrace. It was quite funny because when he did say that, the camera did pan to the Brazilian delegation in which we saw President Lula da Silva and all the people around him, and the energy gave very much Tani. Who did he say he hugged? I don't know anything about that, but it was quite interesting to see the dynamics between the two of them, especially since they had been at quite vocal and obvious political odds. Talking about political odds, you heard in the comments what Donald Trump had to say about the United Nations itself, but he did warm up as well. We did see pictures and of course clips of the faces of Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the United Nations, and he remained quite stoic, even as Donald Trump said that he had had a meeting with Guterres, and it seemed on the whole positive. So you can imagine the UN and the higher echelons of that organization's reaction to Donald Trump's comments, because they were quite scathing when it came to discussing the UN itself. So there was that. Now, moving on to a more lighter part of yesterday's proceedings, Tuesday's proceedings, we did see clips of French President Emmanuel Macron calling Donald Trump on the phone personally when he was trapped in the road closures trying to get in and around New York and onwards to United Nations headquarters. What is very interesting about being in New York around the time of the General Assembly is that you could be walking down the street and bump into any president, and they will literally just be there. Of course, they'll have people around them, but it's very easy to bump into someone here and someone there. So what Emmanuel Macron experienced is really the reality of the road closures here. The footways are often closed. It's very hard to get around with vehicles. So it was quite interesting and refreshing to see, an entire president also caught up in the realities of getting around these areas of New York during this time. He did call him and tell him that he was stuck in traffic because of Trump. It was quite a light and enjoyable moment. He did also take that opportunity to take some pictures with fans and with other supporters. So that too was quite a memorable portion. Now, moving on now to Ukraine. Now, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy is due to give his remarks to the General Assembly today, this morning. But he was walking around the UN HQ yesterday, and he did have a meeting with Donald Trump. Now, after his meeting with Donald Trump, he went in to go in for a closed-door briefing with invited media. So I had seen, just to my earlier point of bumping into a president randomly, I had seen him walk ahead of me. Naturally, I followed along, and I saw that there was a big crowd of people gathering, trying to get into this room where Zelenskyy went into. Immediately, I discovered that this was a room only for invited press, and I tried very hard to get in. Initially, they told me that they didn't recognize Arise News. Can you imagine that? But I still managed to get my way into the room and ask him Zelenskyy a question about, Africa and his experiences of Nigeria and African countries in his own fight for peace and security. Unfortunately, he wasn't able to answer my question. But what he did do in that press conference was discuss his own meeting with Donald Trump. The unsettling part about it was that he didn't go into specific detail about what they discussed, especially as it pertains to this issue with Russia. He himself talks about Russia and about how Russia is in a far weaker position than it's letting on, that it has suffered a huge cost, but he clarified that that cost is not financial or economic, but rather on the human side of these things. And he did say that he is definitely focused on keeping this flow of support ongoing, despite the fact that these conversations in terms of a peace prospect between him and Vladimir Putin seem to have hit a real roadblock. Many questions were asked to him about what he is going to do about the situation with Russia, since we don't seem to be any closer to a peace pact. But Donald Trump, true to his name, did come out and talk about the contents of his conversation with Volodymyr Zelenskyy, which did include the possibility of him being able to take back land that had been occupied by Russia. So, there you have it. As I said, Volodymyr Zelenskyy will deliver his remarks later on today. So it'll be interesting to see whether or not he goes into a bit more detail about what he feels about Russia, the prospects for Ukraine. But yes, a lot happening. In terms of the African countries that delivered their remarks, Angola did deliver their remarks. Also, Cyril Ramaphosa did earlier on in the day, and he talked a lot about, of course, global cooperation and making sure that his country was able to reap the benefits of this type of global governance. Those are your stories. Love to hear your thoughts before we move on to the papers.
Real quickly, I don't know what happens in Trump's head, but I thought that this was the same Trump that said he can make a peace deal with Putin. Is it because he's been deceived now, like we said was going to happen? Is it the same Trump that stalled the progress of Ukraine in the war by not giving them the weapons they need? He's now the one having a vote fast to say that they can actually take back land that Russia has taken, which in my own honest opinion, I don't believe is going to be possible, especially around the Donbass region, because it's for over 10 years, Russia has taken most of those land, they've encroached on that land, and the war had been on for a while. So you can see what Kamala Harris was talking about in her book and her fears about Trump. And that book came out today. Actually, I was reading some parts of it before I got on the air, 107 Days. That you cannot have a leader that is not steady. And these are the problems. So in that 1 year, or close to a year that Trump has gotten, if he had given Ukraine the weapon to be able to take the offensive to Russia, would they not have made some ground still there? But you just wasted 8 months for a war you said you were going to end in 24 hours. The same Trump went ahead to scare the world about immigrants. The same immigrants that built America. He forgets historically that those that built America scientifically were the likes of the immigrants, the German immigrants, like Albert Einstein, that had to leave persecution, and some other Jewish people that came from Germany because of the same thing he's doing today. that was what Hitler was doing then. He forgets in a hurry that he is an immigrant himself, from the generation of an immigrant. Originally, Trump is from a place called Karlstadt in Germany. It's not originally American. He's even married to Melania, another immigrant. So these assaults on them, is that the way forward? Rather than going the path of the Democratic Party when they have something they call the dreamers, that people that came in as immigrants can actually aspire and go through the ladder and become citizens? They're lecturing the world all sorts of lies and scientific putrefactions. So it was a sadder world yesterday after listening to his speech. And you can see the reaction on the faces of the people, they're the world leaders, that what such a joke has America become.
Always. All eyes on Trump's speech. We called it yesterday at Femi, of course, the biggest speech yesterday that a lot of people were looking forward to was Trump's speech. We also anticipated what he might say, and he didn't move too far away from that. Speaking against globalist institutions and attacking his host, the United Nations itself, and talked about a few things. Let me just share a few, some highlights from his, from what he said. And first of all, let me actually say well done on catching Zelenskyy in that room and asking that very important question, even though he didn't respond. Well, thank you for putting Africa and Nigeria's voice on the global scene, which is what we do here at Arise. Well done. You've done excellently at the UN. But let me going back to Trump's conversation. Number one, he talked about what he's also always said about the UN. He questioned the United Nations as an institution and whether or not it was still a viable institution. And their role in migration and ending or even promoting wars in certain areas. He gave himself kudos and almost attributed to himself what the United Nations has not been able to do in years. He said all they did was write strongly worded letters without a lot of action, and so making them almost lame duckish in their style. He also talks about its inefficiencies, criticizing simple things that ought to be working, like the escalator where he was stuck on, and of course his teleprompter that stopped working. That went quite viral in terms of his evaluation of the competency of the United Nations, questioning them even down to that level. Some people have had time to mull on that, and we've often questioned the role of the United Nations in wars, whether it be between Ukraine and Russia or the Israel and Palestine, and how they haven't really been quite effective. And that is one of the reasons why the United Nations was set up. So it was food for thought for them, and one must admire his boldness to be able to call them out even on their own stage. But his claim that he's ended 7 wars, of course, has come under a lot of dispute because the wars he's claimed to have ended, many of us can see that they're still very much on. So even with that, you can also put a question mark on that. He also heavily criticized the European nations, especially their commitment, whether financial or move with climate change. He called it the greatest con to humankind. And he talked about the fact that rather than them spend time and money on things that matter, for instance, migration and invasion by aliens in their country, they're spending time on climate change financing. It's important to know that European Union has committed $1 trillion in sustainable financing over 10 years, from 2021 to 2030. So he was right in saying that they were focusing. But again, you might say that what we see today is as a result of climate change, and there's reason and cause for the world to be serious about it. So even though he's a climate change denier, there's still conversations around that. But a number of things to get through. Trump at the United Nations, we will not forget that. Only that, unlike 6 years ago when a lot of people were laughing and took on his speech quite well, this time was very serious faces in the audience, and perhaps the way that he has positioned in the last few months since becoming president of the United Nations. United States. I don't think he'll be given any more funding. He's cut a lot of funding to the UN, and I believe that would continue as he continues to make this push for nationalism as opposed to globalist institutions.
Okay, Adefemi, let me start with the humorous side of your presentation this morning. First, you said you wanted to enter a room and they said, what is Arise News? Don't be surprised. You may still get a lot more of that. The average American has an island mentality. It's not only Trump that has an island mentality. They have an island mentality. They don't even know that, there is any continent called Africa. somewhere, they could ask you, your brother Kofi, I saw your brother Kofi. They think Africa is a country. So don't worry about that. You get a lot more about in that regard, you know. But sooner or later, they will know that we are the global standout news channel, whether they like it or not. The joke is on them. Now, I saw President Macron, who was caught in that crosswalk, and the police officer was saying the president's convoy was coming. I would have expected President Macron, who is co-chair of this 88th United Nations General Assembly, to remind the man, do you know who I am? But apparently, that would not work in the United States. So he had to call the president himself, and then, you know, he even had to trek for a whole hour, close to an hour, to get to the venue. But all of that is about security. Now, let's talk about Trump. President Trump said, I'm always right about everything. If anything was proven yesterday, it is simply that he's not always right about everything. In fact, he made a lot of very ignorant, false, misleading claims in his presentation. The first one being that he's not always right about everything. And I think there is a touch of irony before his presentation. The elevator stopped working. He had to climb physically with his wife Melania to get there. When he was making his presentation, the teleprompter didn't work. Now Caroline Leavitt, the White House press secretary, now says if it is intentional that the elevator did not work, those people should be investigated and fired. Even Trump himself said whoever tampered with the teleprompter should be, fired. Then what did he say? He said he has stopped 7 conflicts in 7 months, and that he thinks that everybody thinks that he deserves the Nobel Prize. No, we don't think that he deserves the Nobel Prize. And other people don't think that he deserves the Nobel Prize. Because he says he has been more effective than the United Nations, which he was even questioning. Yeah. I understand yesterday we were making the point about reform of the UN, but for Trump to say on every case, India, Pakistan, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Sudan, and Ethiopia, Congo, and Rwanda, that he deserves the Nobel Peace Prize. No, there's no global consensus on that. I think that's one gaffe. He said Tylenol causes, that's paracetamol, I think, causes autism, that it is responsible. No, the medical experts have said that is not true. And he's talking about what he does not know. He has accused India and China of propping up Russia by buying Russian oil against Ukraine. Now, the Indian Foreign Ministry has fought back to say that no, President Trump was lying yesterday. He talked about climate change. He said it's a big scam. He talked about drug. Now, Gustavo Petro, the Colombian president, when he delivered his own address, he practically again called President Trump a liar. So I don't know who and who is applauding him. A lot of inaccuracies in his presentation. And he was just lecturing the entire world. He says he's right about tariffs, he's right about trade. Isn't the major problem about he's been terribly wrong about tariffs and about trade, the same way he's wrong about giving a scientific lecture on a subject that he does not know, namely the effect of paracetamol. I will leave the Zelenskyy commentary till tomorrow. Let's listen to him today. Tomorrow. I will be here.
No problem. No problem. Thank you all for your great submissions on the World Brief, as always. Let's move on to the newspapers. Of course, let's take a look at the front page of This Day, the newspaper of record. This Day does lead with Nigeria's central bank cutting its MPR, that's its monetary policy rate, from 27.50% to 27%. That's, of course, a 50 basis point reduction. The cut comes as inflation shows signs of easing. And there's also news, rather, that this move is really seen as a cautious pivot to support credit growth without destabilizing the macro environment in Nigeria. And I know Rotus will get into that with greater detail just shortly. Moving on to the New Telegraph this morning, it does report on the US White House issuing a proclamation that imposes a $100,000 one-time supplemental fee on many new H-1B visa petitions filed from outside the United States, effective from September 21st of 2025. However, the proclamation does include a clause allowing for case-by-case exemptions if hiring the foreign worker is deemed to be in national interest. Now, among those potentially eligible for these exemptions would be physicians and medical residents. So potentially good news for Nigerian doctors who wish to travel and work in the United States. Moving on to the Punch does lead with the consequences of this 8.41 trillion naira oil theft on the Nigerian economy and, of course, on investor sentiment. And then when we look at the Vanguard, meanwhile, it does report on Senator Natasha Akpoti-Uduaghan resuming her duties in the Senate following her suspension. She did go on to make some comments about the Senate President, Godswill Akpabio, calling him a dictator. The Daily Trust this morning does lead with oil and gas unions rejecting the government's plan to sell or reduce stakes in oil and gas assets. And finally, the Nigerian Guardian does lead with UNGA80 and there being wider cracks in the world order amid warnings on aid cuts and the union's future. Those are your papers, my friends.
Have time to analyze, but please don't encourage the Nigerian doctors to go, to the United States of America. Let's fix our health sector here and let them stay back home.
If they are looking for H-1B visa, they will have to pay $100,000.
They said they're exempting medical, that's what I'm saying, the medical workers. So healthcare workers.
So if they are not going under the lottery, right?
Yeah, they shouldn't go, please. Okay. Stay back in Nigeria. We need you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Adefemi. Always great to see you on the morning show.